sort of stand over here, if that's okay, rather than behind the podium, so I can see more of you. I wanted to pick up then on what some things that Tim has been saying. If I could have the slides, please. I think it's really important for us not to forget what we already know works. And I think Tim was really alluding to that. And not forget that as students transition and teachers transition back into schools. So really what I want to talk about is the key things then that we do know. And in particular, I'd like to draw your attention to some research that I came across about 4 years ago, which I think has had profound implications for the way I think about teaching and learning. And I think will have profound implications for the way you think about it too. I'd like to talk about that. I'd then like to think about it in terms of how we then lead learning thereafter. And I'll give you some very explicit things that we can perhaps do there, and probably really talking about essentially developing learning competence in young people. Okay, so let's start with this. And when you read this, I think you'll start nodding. One of the greatest enemies of effective teaching is student misunderstanding. No matter how well you describe something, how well you illustrate and explain it, students will think of some new way of misunderstanding. I think this is true. Okay, Graham Nuttall said this in 2007, and I want to talk about his research because it is very, very powerful. He has summarized this research in this book. 40 years he spent recording student conversations, internal dialogue and dialogue that they had with the students around them. Very, very powerful data, reams and reams of data, which told him quite a few things. I'm going to go through some of those key outcomes now. He has summarized it, as I say, in this book. If you want to go to the academic papers, you can do, but I would love for you all to put this on your reading list for you and also for your teachers. Unfortunately, he died just before this was published, but his wife finished it off for him. And as I say, extremely powerful. Okay, but to get us started, I would like you to put your hand up, please, if you know the capital of Laos. One person. Please don't say it, sir, but thank you. Please don't say it. One person in the room currently knows the capital of Laos. Okay, what then if I give you a multiple choice question? Students like multiple choice questions because, of course, the answer's in there, isn't it? Is it Savannaket? Is it Vin? Is it Vientiane? Or is it Luang Prabang? How many people now think they know the capital of Laos? Put your hands up, please. One or two more. Okay. Thank you. Probably about 5 or 6 people put their hands up there. Right. Let me give you a slightly easier multiple choice question. What is the capital of Laos now? Okay. Can you put your hands up, please, if you think you know it? Thank you. All right. This was to illustrate something that Graham Nuttall and his team found out through their research. What he was really interested in was how do students first learn something and then retain it? So in other words, it goes into their long-term memory, not just their working memory, but the long-term memory. And he his team found out that essentially students use 2 systems in order to remember something. And certainly when they're responding to test questions like, what's the capital of Laos? First of all, there is the intelligent memory search system. The student tries to re-find from whatever cues are available the information needed to answer each question. So the intelligent memory search system, it's in there somewhere. I know I've been taught it. I hope I was paying attention. I think it's there. Alongside that is the deductive inference system. And this is using logic. And this is why, for example, you were able to answer the question after the third go, because you knew what the answers weren't, and therefore, by deduction, you said, okay, it's Vientiane. They work in parallel with one another, and they confirm or deny one another. Okay. Okay. Direct recall is very rare. I think I was explaining to some colleagues yesterday or the day before that whilst we know that 10 follows 9, we don't automatically know that a long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical, for example, in economics. We have to think about it. We have to think about it really carefully, such that we are then able to explain why. So the critical conclusion is this: knowledge is not tiny bits that we can count and represent by numbers. We do so, and I'll show you later how we might do that, but for a good reason. But a network of logically interconnected ideas, beliefs, and generalizations, structured so that it can be searched and used to work out and evaluate new ideas. This piece about interconnected ideas, beliefs, what they believe about something, is really important, and the generalizations they can make. Let me show you what it might look like then if we are marking student work, or we're making some assessment about a student. Okay, we can do this. We can say child A got 35 correct, etc. Or we can do this. Child A knows the names of the planets in our solar system and understands their relative size. That's interesting. So they've seen some diagram. She also knows that these planets revolve around a star in the center of our solar system, which we call the Sun. However, this child finds it hard to understand the distances between these planets and why it is so difficult to send a person in a rocket to any of the outer ones. She enjoys reading about and looking at pictures of the planets, and knows how to find and use the NASA website. What we're getting at here are the beliefs and the sort of ideas around, in this case, the solar system, astrophysics. Interestingly, the student can't quite understand the distances between planets. The diagrams aren't really helping her. Interestingly as well, and Tim spoke about this, the counterintuitive nature of the Earth going around the Sun, when the student, when they look out into the sky, will see the Sun appearing to go around the Earth. The original quote: students will think of some new way of misunderstanding something because beliefs and values get in the way sometimes. Okay, so we've got to uncover these. Okay, so if you really want to evaluate student learning and use that evaluation to improve your teaching, then you need to realize that nothing less than knowing how students' beliefs and understandings have actually changed will serve these purposes. You will not know if a student has learned something, retained it, and can then reproduce it later on as required, unless beliefs and values have actually changed, and you know that. Okay. Now, some really important outcomes from this research, as I was suggesting earlier. Any class, broadly, and remember this is over 40 years of research, so this wasn't just one study. Students already know on average about 50% of what the teacher is just about to teach them. Think about that for a moment. 50%. But different students will know different things, and only 15% of them will know what the teacher wants them to know. Can you imagine the implications then for our practice? So half of you already know what I'm going to show you. But that half, if you like, will be unevenly distributed amongst you. So on average, 50%. But some of you will know everything that I'm just about to say, and some of you won't know any of it. Some of you will know a little bit. Some of you will know a lot more. This is why formative assessment and why we talk so much about it is so critical. We have to uncover this as teachers. At any time, a teacher will probably be facing a class in which 20% of the students already know what the teacher is going to say, 50% will know something, and 20% or so will have no clue. This is why teaching is such a difficult profession. Nodding, lots of nodding. So can you imagine that pretty much every class you can go into across your school, you're going to bore the top 20% because they've already done it, they've already got it. The 50% you'll be teaching to, and that's good. They'll know something, they'll learn something as a result. And there will still be around 20% who will have no clue at the end of it what's just happened. So let's talk about our current assumptions then about what good teaching and learning is. So, if we want to present something, teachers provide students with a set of learning activities. I want you to learn about the solar system. I'm going to develop a set of activities for the students to engage in that. We assume that some students do the activities well and learn more, and others do not complete the activities or do not do them well, and therefore they don't learn as much. We just assume this, the extent to which they engage with the activities. Furthermore, the assumption is that all students experience the same activities and perform them according to their motivation and ability. So they'll all do it, it's just that some are more interested than others, some are higher performing than others. We assume this. If the teacher is encouraged to use more open-ended questions or to provide more positive feedback, it is assumed that this will transfer to all the students' experiences in much the same way. So we often tell you, don't we, active learning. Make sure you get that in, because that will improve performance. Use open-ended questions to draw out what's happening in class. But finally, it's also assumed that learning is more or less the automatic result of engaging in these classroom activities. If the students do what the teacher expects of them, they follow the instructions carefully, complete all the aspects of the task, then the students will learn the intended outcomes. These are our assumptions, aren't they, about effective teaching? Problem is, Nuttall and his team found that almost none of that was true. For 3 reasons. There is a substantial difference in background knowledge and skill between the students. There are differences in motivation and interest, and differences in peer relationships and status. It gets in the way. The relationships that the students will have with one another sometimes supports learning, often gets in the way of learning. Okay, and there are 3 implications of all of this, and I'd like to go through those with you now. Firstly, student learning primarily depends upon the information they are exposed to, and also ensuring that you don't allow them to not engage with these, with the information that we're sharing with them. The ways students interact with and understand information will depend on their prior knowledge and understanding, so we've got to uncover it. There's lots of nodding here. Secondly, this is the key piece. Nuttall and his team found that students have to engage with something at least 3 times in 3 different ways in order for them to remember and retain it, learn it and retain it and reproduce it. 3 times. 3 times. They were able to predict to about 80% accuracy that if you do this, they will learn, to about 80%. And the other key finding was this: students inhabit three worlds. Three worlds. There is the public world, the public social, that the teacher by definition knows about, can hear the conversations that are going on between the students. But then there are two worlds that do not the teacher does not have any understanding of. First of all, there's the private social world, the world between the students, the peer relationships that the teacher is unaware of. These are the notes that they pass one another, the things they say to one another on social media and so on. The teacher is not aware, and this gets in the way of learning. Often, and again, Nuttall's team found this, that the peer relationships will determine resource allocation. No, you can't use that book, book's mine. No, you can't have access to at the moment. I'll tell you when I can give it to you. And then there's the private individual world. That's just in here for each student, each one of us actually. Again, which the teacher struggles to understand. And increasingly, of course, and you've heard sort of mental health and well-being, we're becoming much more aware of this world. Very often it gets in the way of learning. It doesn't support it. So again, we've got to understand this, I think, as teachers and as leaders. Okay. So I think then, and this is my thesis, that we have to understand this in terms of developing a learning competence in young people. You will have come across before Chris Watkins' work at the Institute of Education, where he talks about a learning orientation rather than a performance orientation. You would have heard about John Hattie before, about his 8 mind frames, and the fact that I want to talk more about learning than teaching. Not so much about teaching, much more about learning. Teaching often gets in the way of learning. Dylan William, of course, and his work around formative assessment, clarifying, sharing, and understanding learning intentions and success criteria. If students do not know what success looks like in something, they can't plan in order to get to it, and they don't know what it will be. Our own work around metacognitive talk in students and in teachers about verbalizing learning in the classroom for students, but also for teachers. Okay, Tim started discussing things on school level factors, for example. Now, there are 4 levels of factors that drive towards student outcomes, however we wish to measure those outcomes. Maybe it's literacy, maybe it's numeracy, perhaps it's performance in public examinations, maybe it's just keeping young people in school for longer. Whatever those outcomes are, there are 4 levels of factors which drive towards it. I'm going to focus on this one, the school level factors. We want to develop a learning competence in young people. How can we as leadership bring that about? Okay, there are broadly 3 things open to us. There are the pedagogical leadership practices that you yourself will have. There is policy, creation of policy, and then ensuring that there is quality implementation of that policy. So that policy doesn't just sit on your intranet or your website or on a file in your room, but is actually made alive. And I can give you an example now of how we can do this. Okay, so this is Chris Day, a quote from Chris Day and his colleagues at the National College of Leadership in the UK. More evidence has been uncovered to support our original finding that school leadership is second only to classroom teaching as an influence on pupil learning, on student outcomes. So you come second to your teachers, but you are critical in this process. Steve Kemmis and his colleagues at the National Research for Professional Practice in Australia. Effective school leaders therefore create the conditions. You create the conditions under which teachers are able to maximize the opportunities for all students to progress their learning. So you create the environment, and this is where you come in. So how can we do that? Okay. We can do that through policy. So we can have a teaching and learning policy, for example, which says that teachers will explicitly teach key concepts in the subject disciplines. Tim mentioned threshold concepts, those concepts that just open up new gateways, new avenues of learning for a student. You explicitly teach them, draw them out. So for example, if you were to teach in mathematics addition and subtraction in primary school, or the slope of a line at IGCSE level, O level, or even calculus at A level, there is a concept that underpins all three of those areas called change. And if students can understand that that's why, or that is what is happening when they're learning subtraction, calculating the slope of a line, etc., that change is happening, and that mathematics helps describe change, it helps then for them to think about and connect these ideas and these beliefs that we talked about earlier, that Nuttall talked about earlier. You could have a student behavior policy. Students will not talk while another student is talking. I used to have two sort of rules really in the class when I was teaching. One was don't talk while others are talking, and the other was don't do anything that gets in the way of your learning or the learning of anybody else. Those pretty much covers everything, really. You can phrase that more positively. You can say students will actively listen to another student when they are talking. You can have a parent communication policy, for example. There will be one student-led conference per year for each child. You write it into policy where students are talking about their learning. Or you can have a teacher evaluation policy which says something along the lines of learning to learn, developing a learning competence in young people will form a key element of how teachers are evaluated in the school. Teacher evaluation is critical, of course. It's the number one factor, teaching factor, classroom level factor to improve outcomes. So why don't we just focus then on this last piece, teacher evaluation, and what that might look like in your school. Broadly, there are three sort of ways in which you can do this, 3 data points in which you can gather information about how well a teacher is performing. You can use student voice data, you can use student progress data, and you can use lesson observations. Now, lesson observations are probably used significantly in your school, but I'm going to share something with you. If you want reliability in lesson observations, you have to observe them at least 5 times by 5 different people in order to get a reliability score of 0.9 or above. We use 0.9 in our assessments, so that our internal consistency, our Cronbach's alpha, if those of you who know what that is, we have to have that, a 0.9 or above, in order to be confident that when we give an A star and so on, that the measurement is doing what we want it to do. So let's look at some student voice data or instruments to gather student voice data and see if they connect with some of the things you're already doing in this area. This is my favorite, and I've probably shared it with you before, but it's extremely powerful. Very simple, but very powerful. We call it a force field analysis. And what we're asking students on the left-hand side to do is list all the things that help them learn. And on the right-hand side, all the things that get in the way of learning. Very, very powerful, very quick way of understanding what's happening in a classroom. You often see on the left-hand side, the teacher supports me, doesn't laugh at me if I get something wrong. On the right-hand side, you see the opposite. The teacher and other students laugh at me when I get something wrong. The learning environment that the teacher creates is critical to learning. So listen to what they say or read what they say and do something about it if you're seeing a lot of negative things on the right-hand side. Another example is this one, and I've just highlighted the one that really relates to learning competence. But were you able to talk about your learning in the lesson? Yes, a lot, a little, not at all. Metacognitive talk is a critical way in which we can understand whether students are actually learning or whether we just hope that learning has happened. Using instruments like this, bring that out. Here's another one. This is for all teachers. So colleagues, students will actually complete this for all teachers. So again, I've highlighted in red for you those that speak specifically to learning competence. So do teachers share learning intentions and success criteria? And remember, as I say, if students don't know what success looks like, they can't plan to get to it. True of nearly all teachers, true of most teachers, and so on. This is quite a sort of powerful way of gathering quickly what's happening broadly within across your faculty, your teaching faculty. Do they let students know how they are doing? Do they encourage us to talk about our learning? Do they encourage us to talk about our learning with each other? And so on. Okay, what about student progress data? Now, I've got an example here that is, I often use this because it's a very powerful tool, very simple and very powerful tool for individual teachers to look at. But you can look at this at the sort of system level as well. So you have a list on the left-hand side of students, and teachers designed a task for the students to take in September, the beginning of the term, beginning of the school year, and they chose it very carefully, and they were given scores. So the students were given scores in September. Then they chose a task at the end of the term, very carefully, because it reflected what was about to happen in the learning between September and November. And then they compared the difference between the September task and the November task. And they created what we call individual effect sizes. Now, broadly, an effect size is the difference between two standardized means, which essentially, for each individual student, means you take the September task away from the November task, and then you divide by the standard deviation of the class. It's just a way of comparison. The higher the score, the individual effect size, the greater the progress made. Now, I said earlier that numbers don't tell you anything. What you then need to do is say, okay, this now starts a conversation as to why. So, for example, David appeared to go backwards. What was happening with David between September and November? Christina and Cal, they seem to do really well. Very high effect sizes, 1.54 and 1.43 respectively. Why was that? Were the sort of interventions or the strategies that the teachers and teacher were using in that time, were they working for them? But why didn't they seem to work for David? And then more sort of average progress, if you like, from the other students, 0.55, 0.66, and so on. As I say, what's important here are not the numbers, but the conversations that happen as a result. It is possible. So you've got an effect size for the whole class here, and that's essentially taking the average score in November, the average score in September away from the average score in November, and then you divide by the standard deviation again. Remember, that's just a measure of spread variance to give you 0.62. And it's possible to say that class made, on average, 0.62 progress between September and November. But as I say, then the key thing is, what are the conversations that happen as a result? Student progress helps you make some judgments about the teacher. But be very careful about not tying this to remuneration, recruitment, and so on. Okay, I mentioned about lesson observations and the various ways in which you can do this. I'll just show you two. This one is essentially measuring the interactions between the teacher and the students. There's three. There's the key here at the bottom. You can either have an X, which denotes a negative interaction or in dialogue about learning. In other words, essentially the teacher saying, please stop that. There's no dialogue about learning, really. The positive interaction, which is, can you tell me more? Does somebody have something to add to that? And then a student responds, so bounce and so on. Or there is questions, and sometimes you can do this, questions from the student to the teacher, or indeed from the teacher to the student, direction of the arrow you can indicate there. So you can see student Z at the back of the class, very negative interaction. So going back to this point about bottom 20% potentially just losing them, maybe student Z, and potentially student A actually won't have learnt anything in that class, potentially. Whereas the more positive interactions elsewhere. Again, this is just about dialogue, about learning. You can use all sorts of criteria here, but it just gives you a very quick indication of what's going on in the classroom. Or you can use criteria templates, and this one I've just sort of mocked up for you. So this is teaching approaches that support the development of metacognition in learners. And then you can see evidence, you can list evidence on the left-hand side, and then comments that clarify it on the right. So the teacher uses bounce strategy to encourage further thinking and responses from students. Would you like to add to that? What about you? LD asks students to discuss in pairs how they're going to approach a particular task. So success criteria have been shared, and students are going to plan on how to get towards it. Or they circulate around and so on, or they introduce thinking routines. And I know that many of you are aware of the Harvard Project Zero thinking routines, and you're using those in your classroom. Okay. So just to recap then, I'm waiting for time. So the greatest enemy, according to Nuttall and us, to effective teaching is student misunderstanding. It happens all the time. Our assumptions about teaching need to be checked. We need to be really careful about our assumptions. Just designing the activities and hoping the students will engage with them will determine learning we need to be careful about. There are so many differences in background knowledge, motivation, interest, and standing with peers that often this just gets in the way of what you're trying to do. They will interact with concepts, or they need to interact with concepts in 3 different ways in order to remember it. Remember about the private, social, and private individual. Don't forget about it. It is happening all the time. And often, again, that will get in the way of learning. And then, therefore, it often is about asking young people to think about their learning, to talk about their learning, and for teachers to openly facilitate that, actively develop it in young people. So, colleagues, thank you so much for listening. We're going to go into questions, is that right? Okay, thank you.
So we will now take a few questions. If you could please raise your hand if you have a question, and my colleagues will bring the mic to you. Okay, here, yeah. Sir, if you could please share your name and the school, and then your question.
Okay. Dr. Yasir from Biggs, Blessed Islamic Grammar School. I joined late, so I missed most part of the speech. But when you mention student level, school level, and classroom level, these levels, what we found that what the student is facing at home, what is the condition at home, that is actually another factor causing the class learning outcome. So should it be 5 or 4, and we can add it to student level?
Okay, that's a really good point. And I didn't explain the student level factors at all, but student level factors include what is happening at home. So for example, we often make assumptions about the number of books they have access to, or the support that parents have with them, the aspirational level that they have. But it even goes sort of to very basic things like nutrition, the extent to which they're fed well, and so on. So student level factors are critical, and they often refer to the 50% that you don't see. So we think 50% of what's happening in a school is due to, or 50% of success is due to what's happening in the school, the teacher, and the conditions that are created. And 50% is what the student brings themselves. So thank you for
Thank you, Lee. Can we have the next question, please? Anybody in the hall? At the back, please. Please introduce yourself and then we'll go to the gentleman and then come to you.
Okay.
Good morning. I have a question which is building on the previous information that you talked about, that it's 50% of a private life which is affecting a student's learning. So does that then beg a question, the requirement of a counselor at school level, not just an educational counselor who guides them about the university, but someone who guides them through this process because of the disconnect that they're feeling from all of that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. That's right. So now there are various ways in which you can do this in schools, of course. You can have pastoral care people, you can have form tutors and so on, not just to mark them in the morning, but actually to ask them what's happening in their lives and what's going on. And teachers themselves. So I think we all have a responsibility to help support, uncover and support what's happening at home. Yes, various ways. Certainly school counsellors who actually are attending to the mental health and well-being of young people. I think increasingly schools are investing in this resource. So,
Thank you, Lee. The lady in the front.
Thank you.
Please share your name, your school, and your question.
This is Uzma Shakil, Karachi Generation School. Lead, thank you so much for giving an insightful to many different aspects of teaching and learning. I would say learning and teaching. I had a question regarding the policy, teacher evaluation policy. You talked about student voice and then progress data, and I think it was done intentionally. The third was lesson observation of teachers, which you talked about 5 times, done by 5 different people.
Yes.
And that is an uphill task, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you very
So
much.
what would you suggest? I mean, an alternate to it, maybe peer observation. So what is that leading to?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I expect many people thought, oh no, how are we going to get 5 done by 5 different people over the course of a term or a year or whatever? The resource, we just don't have the resource. What I was highlighting actually is the limitations of lesson observations, and particularly the judgments that are made on just one per term or per year, particularly if it's the same person doing it. So what we're really looking at are essentially learning circles or triads, and essentially setting up teachers in ways in which they can support each other through the process. So I highlighted the typical ways in which we would evaluate teachers, but actually there are flaws or there are concerns about all of them because of the reliability piece. That's why I said, if you really want to rely on these things, you have to do it 5 times by 5 different people, qualified people actually, not just sort of anybody going in. So use the outcomes of lesson observations really carefully. And if you're really interested in developing practice and developing teachers, then really you're setting, what I recommend is setting up triads. So 3 teachers of teams of 3, and they're supporting each other through the year and beyond. That's really the best way to bring about the changes you're looking for.
Thank you, Lee. We have time for one more question before we break for tea. The lady in the corner there on the left.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, this is Maliha Khan from City School. My question to you would be, you mentioned in the teacher evaluation form that you showed that things that help you in learning and the things that come in your way when you're learning. There was an example given by you where you said that the teacher and the students laughed at me was in one of the columns where it said things that you helped you learning. But
Get in the way of learning.
it's in the way as well.
Yes.
So there are a lot of circumstances where one thing would help one student but come in the way of another. So how do you go about it?
Okay.
And how do you evaluate a teacher on that?
So yes, okay, thank you. So the first point, and if I wasn't clear, I apologize, that actually I used the fact that a teacher and a student laughing at a student would get in the way of learning, not support learning. However, I take this point about sometimes, perhaps just being laughed at, and I'm not recommending this, actually makes a student think, oh, I didn't get that right, so maybe I need to go and check something. When you look at the data from all of the students and you start evaluating it, you can intelligently interpret it. And so sometimes what works for one might not work for another, and I perfectly accept that, but at least you know the context. So you wouldn't send them to me and I would make a judgment on that teacher. You would look at them, I know what that student is saying and I know what's happening in that classroom, and then you build a picture of what's going on. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your
Thank you,
questions. A big round of applause for Tim and Lee.